Without any further ado, David.
Thank you, Chris, and I would be remiss if I didn't congratulate Chris for putting together an excellent program, which at first blush many months ago seemed quite a preposterous conjunction, but now seems quite relevant. So very nice work, Chris. So picture the following scene. It's about minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. It's foggy in every direction. You can't see more than 10 feet ahead of you. Your fingers and toes are cold. You're worried, sick. And you hear the following words from up ahead. David, I have some very bad news. There's nowhere to go but down. Those were actually very happy words spoken by our next speaker, which I heard several years ago on Mount McKinley. I've always wanted to say, here's a speaker that doesn't need any introduction. This is certainly the case. John is an astrophysicist, first, I guess, an astronaut and an explorer, and probably most proud of the final term, explorer, and here's why. But as lead-in, of course, as many of you know, he's a veteran of 5 space flights, including several to the Hubble Space Telescope, which is now in fine shape as a result of his good work. He has more extravehicular activity time than almost any living astronaut, in fact, not well known. I did read in a short biography at NASA headquarters in the magazine that one of his interesting hobbies was mountaineering. That led to a number of interesting discussions and expeditions, which I think we both would say have some relevance for the topic of exploration generally. So we've been to some of the high mountains in the world, including the highest in North America, Mount McKinley, and the highest in the Western Hemisphere, Aconcagua, 22,800. And we have some designs on some future targets of opportunity as well. The analogies that come to mind, and John and I have talked about this a lot, are self-sufficiency. Lack of communications has been discussed many times here today. Resource management, weight control above all else, and group dynamics, all very important. So I've learned a lot about all these topics from our next speaker, and anyone can learn a lot from sharing a tent with someone without a shower for 3 weeks.
Well, thank you very much. Chris asked me if I would kind of summarize the day, but my charts had to be in at the start of the morning, and so we'll see how that goes. We really have an amazing opportunity with the International Space Station. It's an incredible thing, but we have to ask why. Now, why are we doing this? Oops, there is sound to this. I guess we didn't plug that in. But that's all right. Just watch this young fellow. I think it should be clear. This was actually made in 2004 for the announcement of the Space Exploration Initiative, Moon, Mars, and Beyond. And what's interesting is that little fellow, let's call him 3 years old in 2004, sometime in the mid-2030s, he'll be about 35 years old, 36 years old, which is the typical age of a first space flight for an astronaut. And so who knows, that little fellow could go to Mars. But Mars really is within reach. We've learned an enormous amount about Mars. One of the most intriguing things we've learned about Mars, and we heard about it today, is not only that it was wet a few billion years ago, but that it's an incredibly wet planet now. I think the rough estimate is if you melted all the water that we can estimate that's currently subsurface on Mars or in the poles, it would cover the entire surface to a depth of 1 meter or so. I don't know, that's probably, a wag, but there's an enormous amount of water, and of course if there's water, you can drink it. You can break it up if you have a little nuclear device or even solar, and you have hydrogen and oxygen, which you can liquefy, and now you have LOX and liquid hydrogen, which is a propellant. All kinds of things you can do once you have that. You can breathe the oxygen. You can use it for plants, carbon dioxide, oxygen, microbial growth. If we end up eating microbes and fungus, who knows? But Mars, in a sense, I think is closer than it's ever been before, and the ISS is a tool that we can use, but in some ways it seems to be getting more distant, and that's really a policy statement. If Mars is going to get closer, we may need to make some decisions, and we need to utilize the resources we have to get there. And so in that sense, what is the role for ISS? And that's what we've been discussing today. Charlie said something this morning that I resonate with completely, but I haven't always done so. I believe that a trip to Mars must be an international effort. And for most of my adult lifetime, I've been very nationalistic and felt like, it's a lot of trouble when it's an international effort. Most international mountaineering expeditions end up poorly. It costs more, it's difficult in interfaces with metric and English units, and all these kind of things. But in fact, when we go to Mars, if one nation goes, from a planetary perspective, from a human perspective on planet Earth, what's the point? The whole point is, that we are a planet, we are spaceship Earth, we are peoples from, many ethnicities, many cultures, and when we, as a human species, go to the next planet where we may someday live, where we almost certainly will live someday, the whole point is we should go as one planet. And the International Space Station has paved the way for that. This is a picture of myself on the left, training with Oleg Kotov and Fyodor Yurchikhin. This was our winter survival training in Moscow, which after being up on Denali with David, this was a vacation for me. It was only -40 in the Moscow suburbs, whereas David and I were -40 at half an atmosphere at high camp on Denali, which is a lot more severe. But this is a chart from Bill Gerstenmaier. So far, 59 countries have participated in the ISS utilization, in addition to just the partnership that we have with the Russians, the Japanese, the Canadians, and the Europeans. And it's an example of what can happen, what great things can happen when people from around the planet cooperate. And notice that China is one of those, and Taiwan is another. I mean, this is remarkable. And in fact, we have the AMS experiment going up, the alpha magnetic spectrometer or antimatter magnetic spectrometer, led by Sam Ting at MIT, and he has Taiwan and mainland China cooperating on that experiment. I've often said science is the international language of peace, but it's absolutely true. Hubble Space Telescope is another example. Why the ISS? Is it because it's there? Is it because it's a really cool space vehicle? Well, I think it's much deeper than that. And again, I'm trying to keep the 100,000 meter level. It has incredible potential, and when you look at the types of Mars reference missions, and Brett, I'm using some of the great work you're doing, but let's just look at it from the broad brush. It's a halfway trip to Mars. You leave on a rocket, you start on Earth, you travel for 6 months in weightlessness, and at the end of your trip, you descend into a planetary surface. Now, we can quibble about 3/8 of a G or 1 G on that planetary surface, but as we've heard, if you have a spacesuit on, like carrying a big backpack, you're loaded. Actually, that reminds me, the space shuttle rocket, solid rocket motors on the side, when you go to launch, they say loaded. It's like, watch out, those things are loaded. But your spine is loaded with the extra weight of a spacesuit. And so you may actually have terrestrial loading, in which case there's no issues. Your bones will get stressed. Now we have to provide the nutrients and support so that you can continue to grow bone back. But so that's the big picture. We launch on a wonderful vehicle, the Soyuz. We traverse to Mars in our Mars ship. And at the end of the mission, you come down. And I challenge anyone in the room, except perhaps our JPL colleague, is that Mars or is that Kazakhstan? It's indistinguishable. It's really remarkable. We've seen this picture earlier. I hope we don't land on Mars that way. But we do routinely. And routine is a bad word to use because nothing about spaceflight is truly routine. But repetitively, we land in the steppes of Kazakhstan this way. And I think it's truly phenomenal. Once we land, though, it's time to get to work. And I think it's still an open question of what will it take in terms of crew systems, in terms of training, in terms of remote support from Earth, so that when crews do land on Mars, they can start working right away. If it's a short stay, time is precious. If it's a long stay, they still want to get to work, and there may be a condition where the spaceship is tipped over, and they have to erect a block and tackle to flip it back up so they can survive. This is the nature of exploration. It's hard. We're doing hard things. Usually, this is when an ISS expedition ends. You saw that soft landing rockets firing the parachute. You've heard about Nick Budarin, Ken Bowersox, and Don Pennant on Expedition 6. This is the most recent one. Looks nice and comfy there in Kazakhstan, lots of good support, it's warm and sunny. And we call it an end there, and we move into the rehabilitation phase almost immediately. There's, family greetings and such. We're flying people directly back from Kazakhstan now to the US for that rehabilitation. As you may have heard in my comments, it's just remarkable that within 2 weeks of landing, people are up and around and running around cones and doing squats and lifting and all kinds of calisthenics and things. And it's a real testament to all the folks, many of whom I've worked with here in the audience in space and life sciences, that we do have in-flight countermeasures, that we have pre-flight countermeasures. The best way to survive a long-duration space flight at the end is to do all of your homework ahead of time, to spend a lot of time in the gym. And believe it or not, if you spend a lot of time lifting and doing all the work, you can increase your bone density before flight. There's either little to no loss in many of the bone areas or some slight loss, and then when you come back, you're in pretty good shape, and then you start reconditioning. And there is remodeling and things like that, details that are very important, but we're doing extraordinarily well, and it's a testament to all the work that you've been hearing about. Well, that's the end of a typical ISS mission now for Mars. When somebody lands on the surface, that's the beginning of the really interesting part. Psychologically, I see few problems of a crew getting to Mars, for instance. And it's the same on a mountaineering expedition. You have this extremely high performance challenge ahead of you. And we've seen through the history of exploration, as long as recorded history, in fact, that people thrive in adverse conditions, thrive on adversity. In fact, there are a few people who are gluttons for punishment. When you have that challenge ahead of you, the hard part is going to be the return trip. It'll be on the downside. When you've achieved this amazing goal and now you have 6 months or so coming back, can you keep the motivation to maintain all of that exercise regime and everything else for the return trip? And then, as we saw with some of the Apollo astronauts, once you're back on Earth, what are the psychological challenges of having spent this enormous amount of time, a lifelong dream, to get to Mars? You've come back, you've debriefed, now what? All the elements are in place to use the ISS today as one of these half missions. Pre-flight training, as long as you saw a timeline from some of our colleagues in the ISS program, Increment Manager and MOD, that work is starting. But at some point, and there is a sense of urgency, because the space station is hopefully extended to 2020, maybe as long as 2028, a structural lifetime. So there's a little bit of urgency. We need to get cracking on this. But you should start training crews 3 years, about the time they're assigned, 3 to 5 years before flight, in the kind of things that we're going to do as ISS as a Mars testbed. Then, of course, in flight, we're going to use that as a cruise phase. And there's many, many things we can do, both operationally and then technically, as I'll describe. And then once we land at the end of the mission, initially on Soyuz, hopefully later with our commercial spaceflight providers, once we land, then we should start the Mars trip. And we'll start small, a few days, then weeks, then maybe a month. And after that, there's probably a diminishing return. Once we're on orbit, and on orbit now, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And you've heard about that today. Defense against weightlessness. Many of you may have come in here with the impression that we go to orbit, we come back and we're rubber chickens, and it takes months or years to rehabilitate. You've heard me say, and I'm not a doctor, but I was trained as a crew medical officer, both for the ISS and for Space Shuttle. But what I'm observing from fellow crew members, not sharing any private medical data, is that they're doing extraordinary things after 2 weeks. And the secret is not some amazing drug, or some strange, medical device. I know this is shocking. It's diet and exercise. Who would have thought? And it has wide applications on planet Earth, too. Imagine that. Now, it's not easy. It's a huge time sink on orbit. It takes a couple hours a day to maintain the kind of workloads you need just to have a slow decline. On the other hand, if you're going to Mars and you're 6 months in a spaceship, and after 2 weeks the Earth is so small it's uninteresting, Mars won't be interesting for another 5.5 months to look at. Now, you might be a fan of astronomy, So you might have a small telescope, but what are you going to do with the rest of the day? There'll be maintenance and all kinds of things we can talk about in terms of in-flight learning, training, in-flight training. If you're a bridge player, maybe that's good for a week or two. You're going to want to find gym rats. You're going to want to find people who will feel deprived if they don't get their 2 or 2+ hours a day workout in the transit gym. And you're going to want to have exercise equipment that's specifically designed to help maintain all of these things. There are psychological issues on ISS, and certainly for Mars, that we can start to address. Spacesuits and EVA. We're flying the most incredible spacesuits ever built, in my opinion. On the Hubble Space Telescope mission, we were doing board-level away from Mars. I mean, it's absolutely true. The Mars crew will get to their ship in low Earth orbit, check it all out, make sure everything's working, get the spare parts on board before they leave. They'll fire their rocket of some kind and start heading out. And within a couple of weeks, normal conversation will become impossible. I have a 13-year-old son and a 15-year-old daughter. I have an iPhone. And actually, I put it in my backpack for the talk. Normal conversation is already impossible with the youth. They have a phone plan with minutes, data, and unlimited texting. I inspect their records once a month. They're using almost no data. They're using, they have 550 minutes. All of it's rolling over because they don't talk to each other. They text to each other. They communicate via Facebook. This is their mode of, the Mars method is their current mode of conversation. So we may not get it, and we may be in a mission control mindset, but this is how they're already communicating. They totally get that Mars will be okay. Now, when some senior NASA official says, we're going to send a crew to Mars and they're going to teach a class from the surface of Mars, won't that be outstanding? They're going to be smart enough to go, yeah, that's not going to work. 40-minute round trip, I'm at recess when the answer comes back. And when it says, can you repeat the question? I'm out of there. So we do have to realize that it's fundamentally different than the mode we've been operating spacecraft in today. But as I said, from a psychological perspective, that's how kids are communicating now. They totally get that. Food on orbit. At the risk of being really cruel, I'll just say that in 5 spaceflight missions and picking my menu for the International Space Station for a 6-month increment, there's little emphasis still on nutrition for spaceflight. It's primarily about what food tastes good and what's going to make you happy on a long-duration flight. And on a shuttle flight, all food is good food. That includes things like cinnamon rolls that have 8 grams of trans fat per cinnamon roll, and somewhere around 500 kilocalories. We just haven't faced up to the challenges that we heard from some of the folks about food systems for long-duration spaceflight. I once did the calculation for an earlier design reference mission, and all I asked was the simple thing: what does a human body actually need in weightlessness? And keep in mind, you're floating. You don't need the high caloric intakes that are prescribed in terms of just carbohydrates, fats, and protein, plus supplements of vitamins and minerals. And I don't remember exactly, but it was something like 10,000 pounds different than what the design reference mission, lower. And that included packaging. I said, what if you could get rid of packaging? I mean, we really have to deal with this. And specifically for the Hubble mission, we asked a slightly interesting question, because we had the case that we worked with some of the folks here of what happens if we suffer a Columbia-like wing damage and we have to hang out on orbit as long as we can until possibly a rescue mission could come up. We determined we could stay up about 25 days. That was limited by the amount of cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen that would power the fuel cells. We could stay up longer, but 25 days is all we planned for. And with a research doc from the Air Force, we looked at, could we alter the nutritional balance to try and minimize CO2 production? Because we have lithium hydroxide, not a regenerable system. And in fact, you can tune the human body to survive on lower calories. We could have gone almost indefinitely at 1,200 kilocalories a day, because the body will adapt slowly. Not truly indefinitely, but certainly through that time period of weeks to months. And we were able to reduce our carbon dioxide output in principle. And the United States Navy has looked a great deal at that from submarines. And we have a lot to learn from submariners. This is a typical meal on ISS. Lots of packaging. Chopsticks are really great in space. So we really have to deal with some of those things. What about fresh food? This is Scott Kelly and Doug Wheelock. We brought up some lemons, oranges, grapefruits, and carrots to the Mir space station on STS-81 back in 1997. And I've never seen a couple of more happy guys to see all that fresh fruit. And again, they did the same thing. They didn't start eating it right away. They played with it. And the smells of the citrus. We're humans. These are important things. So what's the right nutrition for space? How to provide that at the lowest possible mass, and what about fresh food? On-orbit exercise, I've already talked about that, diet and exercise. The key is you have to actually do it. Having the equipment on board doesn't help unless you use it. That's Katie Coleman on the left and Bob Thirsk on the right. Resistive exercise, I think, was really one of the big keys. We kind of knew that, but it took a while to get good equipment up, and the ARED up there now is really phenomenal. All has to be incorporated into the design and low mass. Let's see, I've talked about some of this: communications, behavioral health investigations, in-flight learning. Submariners have learned this a long time ago, that if you're on one of these nuclear missile subs, submerged for 6 months, you don't get to talk to your families, you don't get to do any of that kind of stuff. What do? They have a gym between the silos, missile silos, so people can work out, and they have a network of computers, and the people who are on board learn new skills. They recertify in their current skills, they learn new languages, they take coursework to advance their military career, all kinds of things like that. That art of learning keeps their brain active and puts off a lot of psychological effects. I think in Antarctica over winter they do similar things. Talked about IT tools, medical. I think we have to go one step more than the crew medical officer approach. I actually think we should go to a wilderness emergency medical technician level. And this is the kind of things that has been talked about a lot at Johnson Space Center in operational medicine, such that we can improvise when there aren't tools. Now, keep in mind that for the most part, and John Charles addressed this a little bit this morning, we're going to select people, and we do currently, who are really healthy and have a high probability relative to other mission risks of not getting sick. So of genetic cardiovascular problems, risk of stones, things like that. We really want to select people who have a very low probability of getting sick, because it is a significant issue if you have some kind of critical condition and you're halfway to Mars, on Mars, or just coming back. Same thing is true, in mountaineering. We take a lot of risks with very little equipment. On the trips with Dave Schumann, we were out for 3.5 weeks. I had one small first aid kit and one small drug pack. Total weight was about 2 pounds. And other than that, well, we had skis, we had ski poles, we had backpacks, we had cordage, so if somebody had a fracture. And fortunately, we also had a rescue radio. But maintenance and repair, we've talked a lot about that, very critical. And the ground team for help, but in a different mode. EVN spacesuits, as I said, remarkable spacesuits. These spacesuits are basically dated from the original shuttle program, derived from the Apollo spacesuits, somewhat advanced. The gloves are outstanding. We can do all sorts of great things. But almost all of the 11 spacesuits that exist on and off the planet that are certified for use, I think it may only be 10 now, who knows. They're all running on life extension waivers. Now, they're great. The parts that are broken we can send up, and we've got new suit parts that can be fixed on orbit, and we need to learn to trust that. Our suits are sort of indefinite life. The Orlan suits have a finite life, and then they send new ones up on a progress mission. It's about time we build new spacesuits, and what better venue than to test them on the International Space Station, where we also have to do real spacewalks. And so we really need to get on that. And I know there's some work going in that direction, and it's funding driven. But this is something I think is very important. Of course, that's because every time I get to space, all I want to do is go outside. So technology, reliable, repairable systems, specifically life support, that's critical. Environmental modeling. Avionics. Avionics is an area where we have lots of custom avionics. No two parts work with each other. We need to get out of that paradigm. I have sort of a dream that there's that all of the avionics is based on one or two families of common components. And these are circuit boards that, for instance, have a field programmable gate array on. That's a chunk of silicon that has a bunch of gates on it that's unprogrammed. It has no personality. It only attains personality when you drop, say, a CPU or a graphic processing or an analog to digital converter capability into it. Then it has personality, and it can run as a multi-purpose computer or a multiplexer, demultiplexer, or in a life science mode, all of these different things. And you have a shoebox full of blank cards. And if something breaks on orbit, well, that's okay. You take it out, service, put a new one in, program it on the way to Mars with the new personality, verify it, and then you're off and running again. And why two families? Well, because you don't want to have some generic problem. But these things are all practical today, and in fact, the space cube that Frank Ceppolina mentioned is an example of that. One of the beauties of this kind of technology is if the ground says, oh gosh, we sent the Mars crew off, and there's an error in 60 of the FPGA codes. Well, that's okay, because you can pull them out, reprogram them with the fix, and put them back in service. So we have to start thinking about this kind of thing, common voltages, common data buses. Medical tools we've talked about. Robonaut 2 or other robotics as partners, and rather than just being extensions of the human, such as the robotic arms, Dexter and the Canadarm, using Robonaut to put out a fire where you don't want to send people is a good example. Or doing EVAs on the outside in the way to Mars. I mean, we saw how it turned out in 2001: A Space Odyssey, when the guy went out to fix the antenna. That did not turn out well. Send Robonaut. and have a spare Robonaut, just in case. I think putting a Mars module on ISS, sometime later in the decade, an inflatable or something, huge idea. It'd just be wonderful to have those systems. You could put a couple of people in there as physiological simulators. In fact, they'd be real. Close the hatch and start the stopwatch and see how it goes. And you have the advantage that if something goes wrong, they can't fix the life support. You can always open the hatch, reset the experiment, close it again. It's like the 500-day Mars mission that the Russians are hosting. But now it's on orbit, and so you have a sense of realism. I think having an immersive experience for people on Earth watching that as well, not quite reality TV, but close, that starts to bring people to Mars. They get to see that we're really going to do this and what it would be like. Clothing. I went through David Schumann's backpack before we went out in pretty close detail. We were climbing Denali. When we climbed Denali, we took the luxurious route. We planned for a 25-day expedition, but we were prepared for 30 in terms of food and fuel. But because I'm a nice guy, I allowed everybody to take one change of clothes for 30 days. And keep in mind, we're burning 5,000 to 7,000 kilocalories a day, hauling 125 pounds or more of load at the start. So we're really, getting grimy. There are no showers, and we loved it. I loved it. I don't know. Everybody thrives under those kind of conditions. That's real exploration. On the space shuttle, I had a change of clothes every day, and not a shower, but a sponge bath. And it's not that much different on ISS. We extended a little bit more, but we don't need that much. And we should think about other types of clothing systems. Perhaps the clothing becomes food for microbes, that we can then use in part of the life support. And then, of course, you've heard about the propulsion, about the Vasimir and Hall thrusters. We can test those on the International Space Station outside, as well as robotic refueling and the things that Ceppolina talked about. Once we land on a planetary surface, that's Jack Schmitt on Mars, House Rock. It's amazing. It looks just like the moon. And once we land on the planetary surface, well, like Expedition 6, with Nick Budarin, Sachs, and Don Pettit, we ought to start the ground expedition. We ought to include that in our ISS experience. And again, that will bring the public along as well. Certainly our research community, our ops community, the astronauts themselves, but also the general public. They need to evaluate, how do we self-rehab? How do you set up camp? What kind of communications are you going to set up? Medical evaluations, in-situ resource utilization, science. We should start almost immediately, whenever we can get all of the safety aspects together. We should start on, the first expedition that we can get where they're starting training now. And sure, they land in Kazakhstan. Let's say we stay there for a couple of days. We'll have all the flight docs right there. If something goes horribly wrong, or even moderately wrong, or a little bit wrong, they can come in, evaluate, and say, okay, everything's fine, we're going to back off again, you can continue. And we'll kind of grow that. And as long as we're on Earth, we're never going to have, the docs and the operators very far away. That's the point. We want to learn from it. So we really got to start with that right away. It's not just astronauts and flight controllers who need to learn to explore. It's all of NASA. This is actually a chart. You can't see it, but that's dated 8/11/2004. I wrote this with Jim Garvin, and we were putting together, Jim's doing email. Are you there, Jim? Are you on Mars? Okay, good. So, that's right. You have to do the tomorrow roundup. So anyway, we wrote this when I was chief scientist of NASA, which was, we had just announced this big exploration program. And we said, we really need to get everyone engaged in Mars exploration and use Svalbard and Hutton Crater and Desert Rats and get people who are going to be the business folks within NASA, who are going to be acquiring things for NASA. Get the flight directors, get the engineers out into the field so they have the same perspective that's very different than how we fly shuttle and station. They should be thinking about the reliability of pumps that we're buying, things like this, all the details, and public engagement. How about having PAO involved in the exploration? I mean, that's a remarkable concept, and they do a wonderful job, but we can do much more. So we should use these extreme environments as test beds for explorations, even beyond the ISS. But ISS is our main human spaceflight program right now, and so we need to utilize that. Exploration style, I talked about this a little bit. This is the crew that we had going to Denali in 2004, up 2004. You can see the NASA meatball there, all of us but two people were from NASA. We called it our mission the Olympus Mons 2004. This was one of the other nods to luxury. This is actually our Olympus Mons 2004 biomass depository. And this is in situ resource utilization. Those are blocks of snow making the throne. And the seat is that's the nod to luxury. We carried that up to 14,000, actually to 11,000 feet, and we left it there. And the rest of the way we just had the snow blocks and the bags and cans. The mountain's getting pretty dirty, so now you pack your stuff out. And this is how we lived. So that's it. Everything you see there is 30 days worth of supplies, food, clothes, fuel. The only thing that we didn't have to carry with us that you would on Mars is water. Oh wait, you don't have to carry water on Mars either. It's there. What a beautiful thing. So anyway, so everything we carried, and what that means is you have to be a minimalist. That doesn't mean it's less safe. Because if we'd carried a lot more, we wouldn't have made any progress, we wouldn't have had an expedition. And there's a balance. My personal opinion is the space shuttle was an extraordinarily luxurious Winnebago vehicle. It was top of the line. And it is top of the line. It's a wonderful multi-purpose vehicle, but it's not exploration vehicle. It's a transportation system. The International Space Station is a luxurious 5-bedroom home. It's not quite a McMansion, but it's not that far away either. When we send crews to Mars, I believe that we need to be minimalists. We have to scrutinize every ounce as we go, and that's a different style. This is our house when we go climbing, and also self-care. You gotta know that's David taking care of his feet. If your feet go bad on a mountain like that, it's bad juju. So this is the expression of that. Right now, NASA, I don't work for NASA anymore. NASA is operating loosely under the guidelines of the Authorization Act, NASA Authorization Act of 2010. It specifies by law what NASA should do. However, there is a higher law than Congress, the laws of physics. So anyway, all right, it's a physics joke, what can I say? I'm a professor at Hopkins now, I had to have one equation. Come on, give me a break. So F equals ma. Well, F is the force of the rocket. A is the acceleration you want. You want A to be as big as possible. The only way to do that is either build a bigger rocket, which, Congress does get to determine the size of the rocket, A is your net result, so the only thing you have control over is M, the mass. That's the mass of the sum of everything you got. You want to make that as small as possible, which means picking people who are not 6 feet tall. No. Anyway, so you got to make that small. So you can't have luxury. You really have to think about the mode of exploration. That's enough said there. Okay, path forward. We need to get started right away, and it sounds like with this iStar program, NASA is doing that. The leadership of NASA is to break down some of the stovepipes. We still have a lot of stovepipes within our space agency that prevent people from communicating, that prevent them from being innovative, and it's very important that we break those down. We need to engage the international partners as we're doing, get buy-in from them, because as I said, I truly believe future exploration will be international, not just because of the reasons Administrator Bolden mentioned this morning, but because that's the right thing to do. That's the way we should do it. But in addition, we need to more broadly engage the academic, the professional research, national laboratories, commercial communities, in the planning and research for these endeavors. Bring in the new ideas, and especially bring in the young folks. We heard some great questions today from students. We should also build an outreach and education. Very often, there's a perception in the outside world that NASA's not doing things that we actually are doing that are really cool. We need to work harder. We ought to have Facebook fan pages for Mars exploration at NASA that have hundreds of thousands of followers. And I think we really can. And then I think we have to work hard on the branding of the International Space Station as a Mars exploration laboratory. I think that branding will help everyone within the aerospace community, but also the broader community at large. Okay, so back to the policy. This is something that's slightly modified, but if you go on to the House Science Subcommittee hearing room, you'll see something like this. For I dipped into the future, far as human eyes could see, saw the vision of the new world and all the wonder that would be. And so with that, ISS is a very powerful tool. We should all use it wisely. Thank you very much. And I'm certainly happy to entertain questions, or we can all exit to the reception. Any questions?
Hi, Dan Hussein, American Patent Agency. I'd like you to answer this question, although it may also be relevant because you alluded to General Bolden's speech. Do you think it's really possible to do something as bold as going to Mars in an incremental fashion? Can you comment on that in light of your talk?
I'm not exactly sure what your question is, but I can say that I think if we had the will and the funding, and will is a huge word, it's not a 4-letter word, it's a national planetary will. We could do a kind of Apollo, push and send a crew to Mars and bring them back safely in some reasonable period of time. But the cost would be extraordinary. The number of people we would have to engage would be extraordinary. And I just simply don't think we have that option. So I think we will have to go to Mars in an incremental fashion, where we use the International Space Station, where we find some appropriate venue to do a deep space mission or deep space missions prior to committing to Mars, whether it's to a near-Earth asteroid, to the Moon, to servicing spacecraft in geosynchronous orbit, these kind of things. I think the answer is yes to all of those as we build up capability over time. I think it gets a little more complicated if you were to ask me, do I think it's worthwhile sending a crew on one of these tremendous long voyages to get to almost Mars, but not to land? That's where it really tugs at my heart. Now, Phobos, nice place to visit. But boy, psychologically, it'd be really hard to go all the way to Phobos and see Mars there for all that time and then come back and not go down to the surface of Mars. Now, which is different than Apollo 8. Frank Borman went around the moon and said lots of nice things and read from Genesis and had a pretty good idea that, at least so he thought, that he would go back to the moon and walk on the moon. This was his practice mission. So, going to Mars, it's pretty much going to be, if you get to go there, that's it. You're not going to go a second time and then land. And so I think that's a little bit harder. On the other hand, if, like the Deepwater Horizon spill, people are on Phobos and they are controlling robots such that they are guaranteeing that the next crew that might actually be just getting underway has the liquid oxygen, the liquid hydrogen in the tanks. That they're running a factory robotically as we ran things on the seafloor 5,000 feet below the surface. Then very possibly, that might be worthwhile. Robotics for sort of a much grander purpose rather than running robots around to look for fossils. I think I'm willing to wait for the fossil information until we get people down there.
John, do you see going to Mars as, if you will, Apollo style? We go plant footprints, a bunch of flags, and then we don't go back there again. Or do you see it as a sustained relationship with the planet Mars, to go back and forth, over many decades? And would you approach getting there the first time differently, depending on which way you went?
Okay, so that's probably a good beer discussion, but I'll try and give you a real quick one. And again, this is just my opinion. I think the first few missions, we're going to be going with some combination of chemical or solar, nuclear, electric. It's going to take a long time to get there. And they're going to be very daring missions. I actually think, it's almost worth sending the first few crews as short stay missions, but it has to be a worldwide imperative to go to Mars. And I have again, into professorial mode, I have a theorem, which I hope we don't prove, but single planet species don't survive. I don't know who actually originated that. But we need to find another planet to live on. Because for one reason or another, the Earth is not going to be our home planet forever. And we have to move out. And that's, there's also just the deep-seated need to go on. That's why I told David, there's bad news. There's nowhere to go but down. I always like to see what's over the next hill and keep going. But there's also a very fundamental thing. So the real objective of going to Mars is to go there so that people eventually can colonize Mars. There's lots of scientific questions. I'd love to know, is there an independent source of life on Mars? Is there life on Mars that might be a common source? All those kind of things, but ultimately it's to live on Mars. Now, we're never really going to explore the solar system, though, or have people colonizing Mars or anywhere else until we get out of chemical propulsion. Somebody asked earlier about a fusion rocket. I think a fusion rocket would be brilliant. It's not that hard. It's not that far off in the time scales we're talking about. And then you're a 5-day transit to Mars. You go anytime you want. Saturn's a month or two away. Then you can explore the solar system. And it's at that point that we start getting the real sustaining presence. That being said, if we look at the design reference mission on a 500-day stay, or a 500-day mission with a long stay, that's not flags and footprints. You're living there. And you think about other examples, well, it was 2 years for Shackleton's crew before they got back. Not a single person perished. And that was constant crisis. I think we can do much better. Okay, I think that's it. We can finally relax after a very stimulating day. Thank you very much.